For this video, I've prepared the pieces for a button-up, short-sleeve, collared dress, expressly for the purposes of showing you how to set a sleeve and how to prepare your collar to be set in. First, I want to show you how to sew a flat fell seam. It's commonly used for jeans. It's similar to a French seam in that it is a way to enclose raw edges using your seam allowance. The main differences between your French seam and the flat fell is that your flat fell is going to start with your regular 1/2 inch seam allowance and by sewing it good to good, like we sew everything. You always sew your pieces good to good, unless you're doing a French seam, which then it starts sewn bad to bad. Like I was saying, the flat fell starts with that 1/2 inch seam allowance sewn good to good, and then you cut off one side of your seam allowance and enclose it with the other side, and then give yourself a top stitch. So that's the last difference between a French seam and a flat fell seam, is that you will see a top stitch on the exterior of the garment. I'm going to treat every seam on the interior of this dress with flat fell finishing. And when you're doing a finish like this, or with any seam treatment, you want to execute the seam every step. It's very sequential. You have to finish your seams before you can move to the next step. Say you have to set in a sleeve, you have to finish the flat fell for your side seam, and you have to finish the flat fell for your shoulder before you can sew in your sleeve. So let me demonstrate just on this short seam right here on the underseam of my sleeve how we do a flat fell. So first I'm going to sew this seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I've already checked the tension on my sewing machine to make sure there's no puckering or waffling due to the tension. So we are set to go with our smallest needle for this rather delicate fabric. Next, you want to take it to your ironing board, and this is what you call a sleeve, and it really helps when you're ironing sleeves for the shape of it. So you see I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance right here, and what I want to do is bust open the sleeve with the iron. Be sure to test out your fabric, especially if it's synthetic. You don't want to melt it. They easily melt. Or use a pressing cloth. Just a little square foot of muslin works, just to protect your fabric. So we have our seam busted open, and what I want to do is cut this 1/2 inch, only one side of this seam allowance. I want to cut it down to a skinny quarter, more like 3/16. So I'm taking off a little more than half of the seam allowance on one side. The idea is that we're going to enclose this shorter edge with the longer edge of the seam allowance. And the way you do that is by ironing the seam again flat. And then fold the long seam allowance so that the edge of that longer seam allowance meets up to your stitch, your seam, and iron it again. Now you have a seam allowance that is inclined to wrap around on itself, and you want to iron it one last time, going the other direction. So essentially we've made a tunnel out of the longer seam allowance for the shorter seam allowance to live in. And when it lays flat like this, we're just going to top stitch the good side of the garment on this part, and it will stitch down this 1/4 inch fold that we have on the interior. So this is how we finish off a really nice flat fell seam. I'm going to top stitch this from the good side at about 1/8 of an inch from the seam. You want to double check that all of your layers are in the right spot and they're doing what you want to do, and you're obviously stitching on the side where you've pushed the seam allowance toward. And this is what the final product should look like on the outside. And the inside. And that's your flat fell seam. Now I want to talk to you about how to sew your collar together. We talked before about an upper collar and an under collar, and it's basically the exact same pattern, except you reduce the size of your under collar by 1/8 of an inch all the way around the collar edge, and then blended it back into the corner right at the neckline edges. So what I want to do is place my under collar right on top of my upper collar. And I'm going to pin it in all of the cardinal points at first. Meaning I'm going to pin it at center back, lining up my notches. I'm going to pin it, line them up directly on top of each other at the corners of the collar edge. And I want to line it up at the corners of the neckline edge. Now, because this under collar is a little bit smaller than the upper collar, you're going to have a little bit of a discrepancy between the layers. You have to distribute this excess within the smaller layer. So see that this has a little bit of a extra amount in this upper collar. All I want to do is find the center of that extra material and pin it right on top of the edge in the center of the smaller layer. So essentially you're just distributing that extra amount as nicely as possible, and you're going to go around the entire collar edge and do that. You're not doing anything with the neckline edge right now. This is what gets sewn to the garment, and we're not working on that yet. Notice that I'm making sure that these two layers are lining up height-wise. I'm not letting the smaller one be lower. I'm trying to force them to meet at the edge exactly. So make sure you're exactly on top of each other, just distributing the measurements within each other. Your collar should look about like this. It has a lot of pins in it. This helps you distribute everything evenly. We're just trying to make the bigger upper collar fit into the smaller under collar. And at this point, you can look at your pinning and see if there are any spots that have, maybe they're taking on a little bit too much of the excess, and you can adjust the pinning accordingly. Just be sure not to move your spots around the center front pin. That should stay exactly the same. Your notches should stay right on top of each other. And of course your corners shouldn't move also. When you begin sewing at a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to start on this side of your neckline edge, and you want to begin at a 1/2 inch in, because this 1/2 inch seam allowance down here needs to remain open so we can apply it to the neckline. So you're going to start your stitch at a 1/2 inch in and go all the way around the collar edge. There are two things you want to remember other than starting at a 1/2 inch from the neckline edge. One, you want to use a short stitch length. A very tight stitch will help keep these corners sharp. And also, you want the upper collar, the bigger piece of your collar, on the bottom. When you sew it like this, the feeder dog somehow works the larger piece into the smaller piece on top. So it always works better when the bigger piece, the excess material, is on the bottom. It just works it in there a little better for you instead of pushing it along the top. We've sewn our two pieces together. You can see that this upper collar, the bigger piece, is a little bit bubbly, and it should look like that because you forced it to fit into this smaller piece. You want to take your piece to the iron and go over your seam just like normal, just to let your fabric relax into the stitches. And now we want to clip the corners. You can also trim the seam allowance at the collar edge if you want, but I'm going to leave this because, one, the fabric isn't too thick and it will give my collar edge a little more substance. Some people will use a interfacing to put in their collar on one layer of their collar, but I did not do that here. I don't want a very stiff collar. I'm going to let mine just be as it is. You want to get close enough so when we turn it right side out, the corners will be crisp, but you don't want to get so close that your fabric will ravel and jeopardize your seam right there at the corner. And then I just come right back out. So we have a close clip right on the corner for turning our collar right side out. Go ahead and do it on the other side, and then we're going to take this to the iron. What you want to do is bust this seam open so it's more inclined to lay flat and directly at the seam, at the stitch when we fold it right side out. It helps if you have an ironing ham or an ironing sleeve, a 3D form to let the shape fall down around it. But just get in there the best that you can, and again, be careful with your fabric, especially if it is synthetic. After you do that, you can begin turning your collar right side out and pushing the corners fully out, fully extended. You might need a little bit of help with a straight pin, but be careful not to pull the yarns of your fabric out. Just be very gentle. Okay, and now we can iron our collar flat. Now that it is right side out, be sure that when you are pressing, your seam is all the way at the edge and you're not tucking any of the fabric in. You can sort of use your fingers to roll the seams completely to the edge before you press it. The next crucial step to making a proper collar is to understitch your seam allowance to the under collar. Make sure you know which side is which. I can tell that this is the upper collar because it's bubbling a little bit with the excess material. So this bottom layer is my under collar. And what I want to do is take both sides of this seam allowance under here and stitch it down to the under collar. I'm going to stitch at about 1/8 of an inch away from my original stitch, and I'm going to run it from this corner of the collar edge all the way down to the other corner of the collar edge. What this is going to do is ensure that the seam allowance, by stitching it to the undercollar, it's going to make it stronger and thus pulling over the upper collar, pulling the upper collar around to its side. So then it's further hiding that undercollar. So now I'm going to take this to the machine and just stitch my seam allowance down to the undercollar. You might not be able to get all the way into the corner when you're stitching your seam allowance to your undercollar, but get as close as you can get while laying it flat underneath your presser foot. And while you're stitching, you sort of want to lightly pull the two layers away from each other so that you know you've got a very clean edge on the outside where your seam is. And now that we've understitched our collar, we can go ahead and press the collar completely flat. Now we have a completed understitched collar that is ready to be applied to a finished neckline. Okay, I've sewn the dress up to the point where it's ready to have its collar and sleeves applied. Very first thing I did before I even sewed up the side seams and shoulder, I sewed my darts up. That's the very first thing you want to do. Get those out of the way because it's easy to reach when they're just single pieces, like a center front and a center back. So do your darts very first. And then I completed the placket. I finished that because you have to finish off this center front area before you can feed it into anything in the neckline. Make sure you finish off this first. And then I've sewn my side seams and my shoulder seams. So it's ready for both collar and sleeve application. We only want to stitch this under collar to the neckline, and then we hand stitch the upper collar to the seam allowance inside to finish it off. So once you've determined which side is your under collar, line up your center back notches good to good. And that's the first pin that you want to establish. So fabrics are good to good, and I've got my center back notches lined up. Then line up your shoulder. I have my shoulder notch and my shoulder seam. Make sure your notch is directly on the actual seam, not a top stitch. Do your other side. And then you should have a center front notch. And that is where you line up the edge of your collar. So this very edge right here, you don't line it up to the raw edge of your seam allowance. You line it up to the sew line. That's where your collar should stop, at center front. Once you've done all those points, center back, shoulders, and center front, then just pin in the middle sections. It should meet up exactly. Once everything is pinned together nicely, just your under collar to your neckline, sides good to good. You can start stitching at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Be sure to stitch down your edge of your seam allowance that's inside of your collar. Leave that folded over like it wants to be because it's already sewn up. But now remember that we left that 1/2 inch open. We didn't start sewing until a 1/2 inch away from the neckline edge. And this is why, because we can get in here to sew this at a 1/2 inch. Now you don't need to sew the remainder of this center front area. Just start stitching right at the collar and then continue all the way around the neckline. And backstitch, obviously. Always backstitch everything you're doing, but certainly this, you want to backstitch at the beginning and end. Be very careful that you're not tucking the fabric and you're not allowing the fabric to crease up and fold over itself. So always check that you're sewing a very clean 2 layers. Adjust your fabric so it lays flatly while you're stitching so you don't get any little tucks or gathers in your stitch. Go ahead and check your seam for any gathers or tucks that might have happened. And next we're just going to clip the seam allowance that we just sewed. Anytime you sew around a curve, you need to release it. You need to either clip triangles into it or just clip it once so it releases. You want to stay away from your stitch about 1/8 of an inch so you don't jeopardize the stitch. But just find the roundest parts. You don't have to do this to the straight parts. So the roundest parts are right at the shoulder where it's going into the back. And just give yourself 2 or 3 little triangles out of either side. And now we need to press this neckline seam flat. And while you're there, also press the seam allowance of your upper collar, the one that you didn't sew to the garment. Press that seam allowance back at a 1/2 inch because this is our tunnel that we're going to use to hand stitch this upper collar to that seam allowance. You want to press your new neckline seam by pushing this seam allowance up toward the collar because this is where that seam allowance is going to live. So if you press it up towards the collar, it will also make that seam you just created very flat, and that's what we want. So go ahead and press all of your neckline seam just like that. Now we're going to turn that raw edge of the upper collar, the one that isn't sewn down yet. We want that seam allowance turned over at a 1/2 of an inch. The last step to finishing your collar is pinning your seam allowance of your upper collar to the seam allowance of your neckline, the seam that you just sewed down. So find your center back notches, your corresponding notches at your center back, and first establish that. Then you can distribute the rest and it goes in quite nicely. You want the folded edge of your upper collar seam allowance to line up right with the stitch that you made for your neckline. This is perfect for a slip stitch to finish this off. Just move down the tunnel and then take a little bit of the seam allowance. Some people even just take one of your stitches that you made at your neckline. So slip stitch through the tunnel, come out and take one stitch of your seam, or take a few yarns of your thread in your seam allowance. Or if you're in a super hurry and you're very good about being neat, you can use your machine stitch and do a top stitch on this under collar, catching your unsewn layer also. So I went ahead and finished my collar off with a slip stitch because I wanted it to have a very neat, as perfect as possible look. With a slip stitch you have a lot more control, so I wanted a very high-end look, and that's what I went with. So our collar is finished. Now it's time to put in the sleeves. Okay, let's talk about how to set in a sleeve now. I have the left sleeve here. I've already sewn the side seam up. That's the very least you need to do to be able to set your sleeve in. I've also hemmed the sleeve. While it's separate from the dress, it's easier to do, so go ahead and do that if you're able to. Now, I have 2 notches on this side of the cap telling me it's the back side of the sleeve, and then 1 notch on this side of the cap telling me it's the front. What I want to do, because this sleeve does have a little bit of ease in the cap, meaning that this measurement is a little bit bigger than the armhole opening on the dress. So I have to gather this very slightly so it fits in the smaller armhole. And what I'm going to do is run a long basting stitch, either by hand. Machine is better because it's a little bit smaller and much more regular. So I'm going to run a machine stitch at about 1/4 inch away from the edge of this cap, between my notches, between this first notch and then the set of notches on the back. So a basting stitch from front notch all the way around to the back notches. Be sure to leave a tail of thread on both sides because you're going to need to be able to pull one of the threads so it gathers a little bit. So a 4-inch tail on either side. I've put my basting stitch in the cap of the sleeve between the notches, and even with the largest setting on the stitch length, it's beginning to pucker the fabric by itself without me even pulling the strings, because this fabric is so delicate. But if you do need to gather your material and it doesn't do that on its own, this should be good enough for me because I don't have a lot of ease in this sleeve. But in fact, I might even need to take a little bit out, which you just relax it a little bit and move the fabric down the stitches. Just work it with your fingers a little bit like that and it will come undone a little bit. But if you need to gather your fabric for more gathering, because you have a bigger ease, you just pull one side of your thread, not both tails. And you can do that from both sides. So pick one side that you want to pull your thread and start moving the fabric up. And it's good if you know about how much ease you need to get rid of, and you can sort of eyeball it. And then once you have enough gathers in your cap, what I do is stick a straight pin through the sleeve fabric, and I wrap these 2 tails, both of the tails on both sides, around in a figure 8 around the straight pin so it holds it there steadfast. Then you do it on the other side, an equal amount or however much you need, and do the same. Once you've done that and sort of got about how much gathers you need in your cap, you can start pinning your cap into the armhole of your dress. The easiest way that I've found to set sleeves in is to keep the garment inside out and the sleeve right side out. And then just drop the sleeve right into the armhole. Be sure that you are working with the correct sleeve. You want to make sure that you have your double notches meeting up with your other double notches. And obviously make sure that you're putting your good sides to good. And the first thing I like to do is pin together my side seam with my underseam. And then I pin my shoulder seam with the cap notch. And then I go back down to the bottom and give myself pins all the way up to the notches. So it's usually like 1 or 2 straight pins, and I stop around about the notches. Now I want to check if my cap is going to fit the rest of my armhole. And you do that by just checking to see if your gathering stitches is removing enough of the ease to fit in there perfectly. And when you walk the pieces along each other, you'll find that you either have too much fabric on one side or it fits just perfectly. And I have a little bit too much fabric on this side. Let me see what's going on this side. That one fits just about right. So what I'm going to do is gather this stitch just a little bit. And check again. Okay, that seems much better, and I'm going to lock down my threads. So that the gathers don't move down the fabric. And to pin the rest of your sleeve cap into your armhole, you want to evenly distribute these gathers as best as possible. And a lot of times you don't want any gathers to show, so you're trying to essentially fit all of this excess without showing any apparent gathers. Now some designs have intentional gathers in their sleeve cap, which is absolutely fine, but it is a design element that you choose. Once you feel like everything's distributed evenly, go ahead and pin the rest of your sleeve in, and then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew around the entire armhole at 1/2 inch. Once you're done sewing, turn your sleeve right side out and check the seam for any tucks or unintentional gathering. If it looks fine, turn it back inside out and remove your basting stitch from the seam allowance, and then clip your seam allowance all the way around your armhole. You want to clip triangles in it to allow the fabric to compress and relax. You want to give more clips up at the cap where you've gathered fabric, because there's so much extra material, you're just allowing for there to be extra space. And this is very important. This is what lets your seam be very smooth and just a pretty armhole in general. So like I said, all the way around, less at the bottom area, and then a little bit more at the top. You shouldn't have them right next to each other, but pretty close. After that, you're going to take it to the ironing board and iron this seam flat. If you have an ironing shoulder, that's great, that works best, or a ham will do. But there is a jump right here in the sleeve. That's the ease that we just sewed in. So it is meant to be there, that little bit of volume right there. You don't want to iron that flat. You want it to stay in there. So if you iron it while it's on a form, that is the best. Try to iron your seam allowance toward the garment side. You don't want to press it toward the sleeve side. Press it toward the garment side, and then you can either top stitch it down. That would be for a more heavier duty or outerwear garment. But finishing off that seam allowance inside is a little bit important, just for every reason you do that, so it doesn't ravel eventually. Otherwise, you can pink it. If your fabric doesn't ravel that easily, like a knit doesn't ravel, a lot of wovens somehow have synthetic crimp in it that keep it from raveling. But if you do have a fabric that ravels easily, you'll want to either bind it or serge it or pink it at least. And this is around about what your end product should look like. We have one set sleeve and a full collar on a button-up dress. Thank you for watching. I hope this helps you with your collars and sleeves.